Good evening, my friend. Come a little closer to the fire, or the candle, or perhaps just the faint blue glow of your screen, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. And if you feel like it, you can leave a small like on the video, subscribe if this strange and sleepy corner of history feels like somewhere you would like to return to. And tell me in the comments where in the world you are and what time it is there now. I always like to imagine these stories drifting out into different rooms, different cities, different nights. And tonight, before anyone rides anywhere, before a banner is lifted, before a sermon turns a crowd into something louder and more dangerous than a crowd was meant to be, before a mailed knight decides that God has become, rather inconveniently, his travelling companion, we should begin with something much smaller, a field, not a kingdom, not a church council, not a crusade, just a field. Because if you wanted to survive the wars of faith in medieval Europe, the battlefield was rarely the first place where trouble began. Trouble usually arrived earlier and much more quietly. It arrived in the wheat, in the granary, in the stable, in the road that suddenly no longer felt safe after sunset, in the fact that your lord had become religious in exactly the way that made your life worse. That was one of the great medieval talents, really, turning somebody else's spiritual emergency into your agricultural problem. Imagine a village in the 11th century, or the 12th, or the 13th. In some ways the centuries change, and in some ways they stubbornly refuse. The houses are small, smoke-darkened, thatched, or tiled depending on the region, always a little too close to mud, and always a little too close to animals. You wake early, not because discipline has made you noble, but because cows and pigs are incapable of respecting sleep. Bread matters, salt matters, rain matters, the condition of a wheel matters, the sound of bells matters, and all the grand ideas of Christendom, salvation, sin, penance, relics, holy lands, sacred enemies, and divine judgment float above this life like weather that has not arrived yet. But it always arrives. Long before holy war became one of medieval Europe's favourite ways to organise mass inconvenience, Europe already had a violence problem. Minor lords raided each other. Castles appeared like argumentative stone teeth across the landscape. Men with horses, swords, cousins, and grudges discovered that this combination could carry them very far. A peasant family might not know the fine legal vocabulary of noble feuding, but they knew what it meant when armed riders crossed a field before harvest. They knew what it meant when grain was trampled. They knew what it meant when oxen vanished. There is nothing abstract about losing an ox in an agrarian society. Lose enough theology, and you may still survive. Lose your ox, and now the devil is personally helping with your ploughing schedule. So, the church, looking around at all this private warfare, tried something that seems almost sweet in its innocence. It tried to tell people to calm down. Not forever, of course. Medieval institutions were rarely so unrealistic. Just a little. A bit on Sundays. A bit during feast days. A bit during Lent. A bit around churches. A bit around peasants. A bit around merchants and pilgrims and women and clergy, and in some formulations even around cattle, which is one of those details that sounds absurd until you realize cattle were wealth with hooves. Protecting a cow was not sentimentality. It was economics in a fur coat. So bishops and clerics promoted what we now call the peace of God and the truce of God. And one can almost picture the exhausted expression behind the idea. If you violent men will not stop being violent, perhaps you might at least be violent on a better schedule. And, in a way, that was a temporary solution. Or it was meant to be. A patch, a restraint, a spiritual fence built around the worst instincts of armed aristocrats. It was not supposed to create a new world. It was supposed to keep the old one from constantly biting through its own reins. But medieval Europe had a genius for taking temporary arrangements and turning them into permanent habits, especially when those arrangements involved law, religion, fear, and the management of men who believed that being told not to fight was an insult to both their honor and their weekly planning. So the Church did not merely try to stop violence. It learned, slowly, awkwardly, and with the kind of moral complication that history specializes in, how to organize it. If one could forbid violence against certain people at certain times, one could also imagine violence that was approved, sanctified, even meritorious. Violence, but with paperwork. Violence, but with preaching. Violence, but pointed away from the church door and toward a designated enemy. A remarkable improvement if you were the sort of person who admired administrative elegance more than human consequences. And ordinary people felt this shift not as a clean change in theory, but as a rearrangement of danger. That is important. Because when historians later speak of holy war, crusade, anti-heretical campaigns, northern crusades, frontier wars, papal calls, indulgences, armed pilgrimage, and all the rest of it, the words can sound grand and almost architectural, stone arches of language. But in lived experience, great ideas arrived in fragments. A rumour in the market, a priest preaching more intensely than usual, a local noble selling land in a hurry, more strangers on the road, prices changing, a clerk appearing to copy a document, a housewife noticing that her husband had become interested in vows, which was seldom good news for anyone responsible for the pantry. This is where survival really begins. Not in heroism, not in banners, in noticing. If your world was rural, you noticed roads first. Roads were information. Roads were threat. Roads were appetite. A road told you whether merchants still passed, whether armed men had used it recently, whether carts were sinking too deeply into spring mud, whether hoof prints were fresh, whether a bridge had been repaired, taxed, guarded, or quietly abandoned. If a holy expedition was moving somewhere beyond the horizon, the road often knew before you did. Roads also had that unnerving medieval quality of being both public and personal. They belonged to everybody, in theory, and to whoever had armed control in practice. A peasant going to market, a pilgrim with a badge on his hat, a knight with servants, a bishop's messenger, a cart loaded with grain, a group of boys driving pigs, a widow carrying cloth, all used the same route. Then, one season, too many armed men passed through, or too many sermons were preached nearby, or too many nervous people began travelling in groups, and suddenly the road changed character without physically changing at all. That is one of the quiet horrors of the period. So many things remained outwardly the same, while becoming much more dangerous. A church was still a church. A granary was still a granary. A town gate was still a town gate, but each had begun to do extra work. The church was now not only for worship, but perhaps a place of refuge. The granary was not only storage, but a target. The gate was not only an entrance, but a decision about who counted as safe enough to admit before sunset. And it is tempting, from a distance, to imagine medieval people as permanently accustomed to danger, and therefore somehow less disturbed by it. That would be nonsense. Familiarity with danger does not make danger comfortable. It just makes the rituals around it more practiced. People learned where to hide sacks of grain. They learned which kin might take in children if riders came. They learned whether the nearby woods were thick enough to conceal animals. They learned which local church had stronger doors. They learned which lord might keep his word and which one treated oaths like decorative embroidery. And because Europe was deeply Christian, these practical calculations were tangled with spiritual ones. If violence was sinful, why was it so constant? If holy men denounced warfare, why did they bless banners? If peace was sacred, why did every solution seem to involve men on horseback making decisions on behalf of hungry people with no horses at all? The answer, unhelpfully, was that medieval society was trying to solve one problem by repackaging it as another. That repackaging happened slowly. First came restraint, then categories, protected persons, protected days, protected spaces, then exceptions, then holy causes, then privileges, then vows, then incentives, then legal shields. Then the very thing that had once looked like an emergency measure began to harden into a system. And systems are much harder to escape than battles. A battle can pass over your land in an afternoon. A system can sit on your chest for generations. Somewhere in a village, then, before the great marching and the famous massacres and the sieges and the sacred slogans, a family watches the local world become more organized around danger. A young man hears more talk of pilgrims, penance, and righteous struggle. An older woman wonders who will cut timber if half the men go off to save somebody else's soul. A miller, who by temperament is probably not impressed by anything, notices that grain prices react to rumour almost as quickly as they react to weather. A parish priest tries to sound reassuring while not actually being reassured. A local knight discovers that the church, which recently told him to stop hitting his neighbours on Tuesdays, is now speaking in a tone that suggests violence may yet be acceptable if aimed with proper enthusiasm. It is one of the central jokes of the Middle Ages, though not a very funny one if you had to live through it, that peace and war often emerged from the same pulpit. And once people sensed that, they adapted. Adaptation is rarely noble in the moment. Later generations like to call it resilience, which sounds prettier. But in real time, it means storing more than usual, saying less than usual, listening more than usual, marrying carefully, selling cautiously, traveling with others, keeping small silver hidden, pretending not to have heard certain things, pretending to have heard other things very clearly, learning the faces of armed men, learning the moods of clergy, learning that public piety and private fear often sit at the same table and share the same loaf. This was how one survived the earliest phase of religious war in medieval Europe, by realizing that war did not begin when swords crossed. It began when ordinary life had to bend around the possibility of swords. And ordinary life bent very easily, because it had no choice. A temporary truce could become a habit. A habit could become an expectation. An expectation could become law. A law could create new loopholes. Those loopholes could reward some people, frustrate others, and teach everyone that sacred language was not merely about heaven. It was about access, timing, exemptions, property, movement, permission. The divine had entered administration, which is a sentence nobody wants to hear before bed, but medieval Europe seemed perfectly willing to experiment with it. And the result was a world in which even the humblest household could not remain untouched by spiritual conflict once that conflict learned how to travel through institutions. That is when the field stops being just a field. Because once violence is organized morally, fields must feed it, roads must carry it, churches must explain it, families must absorb it, and those who do not go to war are still drafted by it in other ways. Their labor is drafted. Their grain is drafted. Their fear is drafted. Their silence is drafted. The peasant, who never sees Jerusalem, never hears a council decree, never meets a bishop, and cannot read a single line of Latin, may still feel the entire pressure of a continental religious movement in the sudden disappearance of a horse, the rising cost of salt, the nervousness of travellers, the altered sermon, the missing men, the locked gate, the whispered accusation, the sense that God has somehow become involved in local logistics. And once that happens, there is no clean line between faith and survival anymore. Only weather, rumour, mud, bells, promises, and the long uneasy feeling that what was supposed to be temporary has begun settling in like a permanent guest. The kind who never leaves. The kind who starts rearranging the furniture. There was, in medieval Europe, a particular kind of disaster that arrived looking holy. It did not always arrive with shouting. It did not need to. Sometimes it came in the form of a sermon heard in a crowded square. Sometimes in the voice of a priest who seemed, all at once, more urgent than usual. Sometimes in the expression on a lord's face after he had listened to a bishop and begun imagining himself in a nobler light than his tenants found strictly necessary. And sometimes it came in the form of a man deciding, with a solemnity that made resistance feel almost impious, that he would take the cross. Now, in theory, this was a vow, a sacred promise, a moment of spiritual commitment, a turning of the heart, a redirection of the soul towards sacrifice, pilgrimage, struggle, and salvation. In practice, it was also a domestic event of exhausting complexity. The medieval household, whether noble or peasant, was not built to have major adult labor vanish for years because heaven had become suddenly administrative. A vow might sound private when spoken aloud, but it was never private in consequence. It entered the house like weather enters through a badly fitted door, quietly at first, then everywhere. A man takes the cross, and perhaps for a day or two he feels larger than himself. He has purpose. He has been seen. He has responded to something grand. Maybe a preacher spoke of Jerusalem, maybe of sin, maybe of duty, maybe of enemies of the faith, maybe of divine favor stored up for those willing to go east or south or north, or simply toward whichever frontier the Church had most recently decided needed correction. And perhaps he stands there with cloth stitched in the shape of a cross to his garment, feeling that at last his life has acquired an outline worthy of memory. Meanwhile, somewhere behind him, someone is thinking about barley. That is the part the stirring sermon tends not to mention. A holy vow does not milk the cow. It does not repair the roof. It does not settle with creditors. It does not make a stubborn servant obedient. It does not prune the orchard, inspect the grain, watch the pigs, mend a hinge, haggle in town, protect a boundary marker, supervise ploughing, guard a widow's claim, or stop a neighbor from quietly moving a fence 2 feet into land that is not his. And because medieval people were not fools, they knew this. Which is why the vow, for all its piety, quickly developed supports. Legal supports, spiritual supports, financial supports, protective supports. It had to. Otherwise, too many men would hesitate, and too many families would say, with complete practical justice, that this was all very moving in theory, but ruinous in practice. So what began as an act of religious enthusiasm slowly gathered privileges around it. Protection for property, protections against certain legal actions, relief from some debt pressures, recognition that the man who had taken the cross was now under special care not only of God, who was notoriously difficult to find for document verification, but of the Church and the legal order attached to it. And this is where it becomes very medieval indeed, because once you create a temporary privilege for a sacred emergency, you create a category. Once you create a category, you create paperwork. Once you create paperwork, you create loopholes. Once you create loopholes, you create human creativity. And human creativity, when mixed with money, fear, and salvation, becomes one of history's least restful combinations. So the cross was not only devotion, it was also a legal condition. That meant a family had to reorganize around absence, but it also meant everyone around that family had to reorganize around the protections attached to that absence. Creditors might find themselves delayed. Rivals might discover that pressing a claim had become difficult. Tenants might wonder whether dues were to be paid as before, and to whom. Stewards suddenly mattered more. Clerks became more useful than usual, which is never a good sign if you are hoping life will remain simple. Some men no doubt took the cross in perfect sincerity and were then crushed by the consequences. Others took it sincerely and also noticed, not without relief, that certain legal inconveniences had softened around them. Still others, because medieval society had no shortage of opportunists wrapped in pious fabric, may have found the vow an attractive way to postpone very earthly problems. This is not hypocrisy in the easy sense. It is more tangled than that. People can believe deeply and still be relieved that belief comes with procedural advantages. A man may truly fear for his soul and also be glad that his creditors must now breathe more slowly. If that sounds unromantic, good. It should. Romance is often what happens when paperwork has been removed from history. Inside the house, then, the vow begins changing gravity itself. If the man is a knight or minor noble, land has to be managed, revenues counted, servants watched, tenures remembered, rents collected, neighbors monitored with the paranoid attention they usually deserve, arms and horses prepared, equipment funded, portions of property sold or pledged. Maybe woods are mortgaged, maybe rights are leased, maybe jewelry goes, maybe a chest is opened, and the room gets very quiet. If the man is poorer, the stakes are no less serious. A small holding cannot spare labor just because the soul has developed ambition. Someone must carry the burden of the missing body. A brother, perhaps. A son too young for the work but now doing it anyway. A wife who has always worked, of course, because medieval women were never ornamental in the way later fantasies sometimes prefer, but who now must work while also representing, defending, calculating, and enduring. And this is where another temporary solution begins to harden, because absences create substitutions, and substitutions, if repeated often enough, become roles. A wife who merely holds things together until he returns may find herself negotiating with tenants, speaking to officials, receiving messengers, checking stores, protecting title, and learning just how little respect some men offer a woman until they need her seal, her memory, or her signature witnessed by the right cleric. A mother may become the household's spine by accident. A daughter may begin as helper and end as administrator. An abbess or female relative may become custodian of documents or treasure simply because she is near, competent, and still alive. No council sat down and said, "Let us redesign domestic authority through crusading absence." That would have been far too honest. Instead, necessity did the work, as it usually does, quietly, without ideology, without reward, and with very little gratitude. So a temporary departure could produce a semi-permanent rearrangement of power inside a household. Not freedom, exactly. One should not grow sentimental too quickly. Necessity is not emancipation. Burden is not recognition. A woman could run an estate magnificently and still be treated as provisional, still be watched, still be challenged, still have to explain herself to dull men with parchment and suspicious eyebrows. But she was doing the work all the same. That is something the wars of faith did again and again. They made improvisation necessary, and then pretended improvisation had always been part of the design. A man goes away to save Christendom. A woman stays home to save the roof from collapsing, the grain from moulding, the pigs from being stolen, the servant from lying, the creditor from seizing, the boundary from shifting, the children from starving, and the whole ramshackle dignity of the household from being carried off by small disasters that never make it into heroic chronicles. And if he returns, perhaps he returns changed, older, sicker, broke, prouder, quieter, stranger. Perhaps he returns to a house that learned how to stand without him and does not quite know how to reshape itself around his presence again. That too is part of survival. Not only enduring absence, but enduring return. Because return is not a magical restoration. History loves departure scenes and victories. Real life has account books. Perhaps he does not return at all, and then what was meant to be temporary becomes the shape of a life. This happened on all levels of society, though differently in each. At the top, regencies and estate management could become extended and politically significant. At lower levels, absence could be simpler and crueler. Too few hands, too much debt, no margin, no miracle. A large noble household might suffer entanglement. A poor one might suffer collapse. And always the surrounding society had to adapt. Priests learned formulas. Officials handled claims. Local communities adjusted expectations. Neighbors grew either helpful or predatory, often depending on whether they smelled weakness. Markets adjusted. Debtors and lenders recalculated. An act of spiritual mobilization became a local economic weather system. There is something almost comical in how quickly the sacred becomes mundane once it has to survive contact with grain storage. The cross on a coat is stirring. The missing ox is not. Yet the missing ox may tell you more about the reality of holy war than 20 Latin speeches. The roof that is not repaired before winter. The daughter who now walks to market under the eyes of men who know her father is gone. The tenant late with rent. The priest reminding the household that sacrifice is noble while never volunteering to clear a drainage ditch. The creditor smiling with that special expression creditors have worn across the centuries, the one that says he respects your piety very much, and also intends to be paid. And then there is the matter of documents. Medieval warfare produced not only widows and ruined fields, but records, charters, confirmations, grants, sales, protections, petitions, deferrals, oaths, seals. So many attempts to nail uncertainty to parchment. It is oddly moving, in a way. All these people living in a world of mud, rumour, rain, and mounted violence, trying to create steadiness through ink. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes a written privilege could hold back a local opportunist. Sometimes a crusader's property really was protected. Sometimes church authority could deter a creditor or a rival lord. Sometimes law did what law claims to do, and sometimes a document was merely a very elegant way to lose slowly. That is another thing worth lingering on. Medieval legal protection was real, but uneven. It depended on who backed it, who enforced it, who could read it, who respected it, and whether armed men happened to find it persuasive. A sealed parchment is impressive. A hungry garrison is also impressive, in a different style. So families learned to live between guarantee and doubt. A privilege existed, but would it hold? A vow was honourable, but would it ruin them? A husband was protected, but were his vineyards? A lord was absent in God's service, but would God personally stop his neighbour from seizing disputed woodland? The answer, as so often in history, was that God delegated heavily, which left a great deal of work for women, clerks, stewards, abbots, cousins, and everyone else unfortunate enough to be physically present. In some places, in some generations, this whole machinery became familiar enough that people began to expect it. That is how you know the temporary has turned permanent, not when it becomes beloved, but when it becomes normal. When people stop acting surprised that a vow has legal consequences. When households know what must be done if a man departs. When there are forms of protection already understood. When the village has seen this pattern before. When the road fills again. When the chest is opened without ceremony. Because last time they already sold the silver cups, and this time there is less left to sell. That is the bleak maturity of a system. At first, the holy expedition is an event. Later, it is a known risk. Then, it is a recurring burden. Then, it becomes part of how society organizes expectation itself. And beneath all of it, the emotional texture remains stubbornly human. Pride mixed with dread. Piety mixed with resentment. Admiration mixed with practical annoyance. There must have been households where a man took the cross and was looked at with tears, reverence, anxiety, and the very strong, unspoken suspicion that he had just created 3 years of work for everybody else. One should allow that possibility. It feels true to the species, because medieval people were not allegories. They were families, complicated, tired, hopeful, frightened, devout, opportunistic, dutiful, petty, brave, and often all on the same day. A vow did not purify them into symbols. It simply rearranged the pressures already there and called some of them holy. And once that happened often enough, Europe learned something dangerous. It learned how to make mass religious action administratively survivable for just long enough to keep repeating it. Not comfortable, not efficient, certainly not fair, but repeatable, which, in history, is often much worse. And somewhere, in a house that smells of rushes, smoke, wool, and stored grain, someone is tying closed a chest of documents, while someone else counts sacks, and someone else stares too long at a stitched cross, and understands, perhaps before anyone says it aloud, that the war has already entered the room. It has entered as a promise. It will remain as an absence. And absence, once it settles into the beams of a house, can be very difficult to drive out. If you lived in medieval Europe long enough, you eventually learned that war rarely announced itself with trumpets. Trumpets were for kings and painters. War, the real kind, arrived first through roads. Not the road itself, of course. The road looked the same. The same ruts carved by wheels. The same dust in summer. The same soft, sucking mud in spring. The same bridges that creaked under carts and sometimes collapsed at the worst possible moment. The same hedges, the same shrines, the same crooked little markers that told you whose land you had entered, whether that lord deserved it or not. But the road changed in subtler ways. And medieval people, who spent far more time noticing the small moods of their world than we often give them credit for, became extremely good at reading those changes. At first it was something simple, too many strangers. Now strangers were not unusual. Medieval roads were always carrying somebody. Merchants with wagons that smelled faintly of wool or spices or leather. Pilgrims wearing badges that told the observant eye which saint had recently heard their prayers. Messengers who rode with the nervous urgency of people who carried bad news and knew it. Peasants driving animals to market. Monks travelling between houses. Beggars who might or might not actually be beggars. All of this was normal. What was not normal was when the proportion changed, when the strangers became louder, when more of them were young men, when they began travelling in clusters instead of pairs, when sermons were discussed on the road instead of prices, when a man you had never seen before asked you how far it was to the next town and whether there were Jews there. That sort of question tended to sit in the air like a bad smell. Because once religious excitement began to move through a region, it behaved a little like fever. It spread unevenly, it intensified unpredictably, and it carried rumours with it, the way travellers carry fleas. Rumours were one of the most efficient transport systems in medieval Europe. They travelled faster than carts, faster than official messages, sometimes faster even than fear itself. A rumour could begin in a monastery, pick up colour in a market, grow teeth in a tavern, and by the time it reached the next valley it had become a certainty, backed by God, 3 saints, and the testimony of a man whose cousin had definitely seen it happen. Rumours about holy war were particularly lively creatures. Some said that enemies of the faith had committed unspeakable acts. Others insisted miracles were already happening to those who took the cross. Others whispered that cities had fallen, that relics had appeared, that divine punishment was coming for the impious, that kings had sworn oaths, that the Pope himself had spoken words so powerful they made grown men weep. And whether these things were true hardly mattered. What mattered was that people behaved as though they might be. So the roads filled. At first, with listeners, then with volunteers, then with men who were not entirely sure what they had volunteered for but had already told too many people they were going. And with every mile those men travelled, the road itself began to change character. Because roads in medieval Europe were also markets. When enough travellers appeared, someone would sell bread, someone would sell wine, someone would offer horses, someone would repair a broken strap, someone would quietly raise prices, someone would decide that religious enthusiasm was all very inspiring, but still did not justify giving away cheese for free. This was how even spiritual movements quickly became logistical events. An army cannot march on theology alone. It requires food, animals, tools, rope, iron, wood, patience, and the constant grinding work of people who are not saints and do not pretend to be. So the villages along the roads began to notice things. Bread vanished earlier in the day. Ale ran out faster. Smiths found themselves repairing unfamiliar equipment. Farmers saw riders cutting across fields instead of staying politely on the road. Children heard new songs. Loud songs, the kind sung by men who had discovered courage in groups and perhaps wine shortly before. And slowly, like weather thickening before a storm, the mood of travel shifted. Travel stopped being routine. It became tense. A merchant who once rode alone now joined a small group. A woman walking to a neighbouring village left earlier in the day. A shepherd kept a closer eye on animals grazing near the road. A miller, who had always been suspicious of everyone anyway, began watching strangers with the quiet calculation of someone wondering whether they might soon become thieves in the name of heaven, because that was the other thing people learned quickly. Religious excitement did not always travel politely. Sometimes it arrived with discipline and purpose, but sometimes it arrived as crowds. Crowds, unfortunately, have a personality of their own. A single man might hesitate to do something terrible. 100 men who have spent 3 days listening to sermons about divine justice may suddenly find terrible actions extremely persuasive, especially if someone louder than the rest explains that God will understand. The Rhineland towns learned this the hard way in the year 1096. For generations, Jewish communities had lived in cities along the Rhine. They traded, lent money, worshipped, raised families, argued about ordinary things, worried about taxes, worried about neighbors, worried about weather, worried about the same small practical concerns that occupied everyone else trying to survive medieval life. Then the crusading excitement began to move. Not east. First, it moved along the river. Men travelling toward the Holy Land passed through cities where Jews already lived. And some of those travellers, overheated with the idea of sacred violence and the logic that enemies of the faith should be confronted wherever they appeared, began asking a dangerous question. Why travel thousands of miles to fight the enemies of Christ when some enemies were already nearby? It is a chillingly efficient piece of reasoning. The crowds that gathered in places like Mainz and other Rhineland towns were not composed entirely of monsters. They were composed of ordinary men whose imaginations had been reshaped by sermons, rumours, fear, and the intoxicating sense that they were part of something vast and righteous. That combination can be extremely dangerous. Local bishops sometimes tried to intervene. Some Jewish communities sought protection within church buildings or episcopal residences. In some cases, authorities attempted to shelter them, to hide them, to calm the crowd. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it did not. Because once a crowd believes itself to be acting on behalf of heaven, even the authority of the church can suddenly appear inconvenient. It is difficult to reason with a mob that has decided it is carrying out divine justice. And this was one of the first lessons medieval Europe learned about wars of faith. They did not always move neatly toward their intended battlefield. They splashed outward. They struck the nearest vulnerable targets first. For people living in towns along the roads, this meant survival often depended on recognizing danger before it fully arrived. Doors were reinforced. Goods were hidden. Families gathered inside stronger buildings. Alliances were tested. Would the local bishop truly protect you? Would the city guard hold firm? Would your neighbors stand beside you, or step politely aside while someone else's house was torn open? No one knew until the moment came. And moments like that have a way of lingering long after they pass. Even when the crowds moved on, the road remained changed. Because people remembered. They remembered which authorities had protected them and which had hesitated. They remembered which neighbors had helped and which had watched. They remembered how quickly ordinary life could dissolve when the language of salvation was combined with fear and opportunity. That memory travelled along the same roads as the Crusaders. It travelled quietly. A merchant passing through might hear the story in a tavern. A pilgrim might repeat it in another town. A monk might copy a letter describing the event. A clerk might write it into a chronicle with careful Latin phrases that tried, with limited success, to contain the horror inside respectable sentences. And so the road carried not only bodies, but memory, which meant that by the time later armies passed through those regions, the people along the route were already wiser, or perhaps simply more tired. They knew that enthusiasm could become violence, that a sermon could become a riot, that the distance between a pilgrim and a looter might be only 2 cups of wine and a persuasive speech. So survival meant watching the road, watching the faces of travellers, listening to what was said when strangers believed no one important was listening, counting how many men carried weapons, noticing when travellers stopped asking for directions and began asking about minorities, wealth, fortifications, or supplies. All small details. But small details are often the first cracks through which history enters a quiet place. And once the road has changed, everything connected to the road begins to change as well. Markets grow tense. City gates close earlier. Tavern keepers listen more carefully than they speak. Children are told to stay close to home. Clergy preach more urgently, though sometimes with the uneasy tone of men who suspect they may have helped unleash something larger than intended. Because the truth, which medieval people understood perfectly well even if theologians sometimes preferred not to emphasize it, is that once you mobilize faith on a massive scale, controlling it becomes extremely difficult. Faith is patient when it is private. It becomes restless when it is shared. And when it is armed, it begins to behave like weather again. Unpredictable, sudden, capable of turning a familiar road into the beginning of catastrophe, which is why, in the quiet villages and towns scattered across medieval Europe, survival during the wars of faith often began not with swords or banners or kings, but with a much simpler realization. The road outside your home was no longer just a road. It had become a corridor through which belief, fear, hunger, rumor, and violence could all arrive together. And once that corridor opened, the rest of history had an easy way in. There is a small detail about medieval warfare that sermons rarely mentioned. Armies eat. It sounds obvious, of course, almost too obvious to be worth saying aloud. But if you wish to survive the wars of faith in medieval Europe, you would learn very quickly that the difference between a religious movement and a natural disaster was often measured in loaves of bread. When the first waves of crusading enthusiasm began moving across Europe, many people imagined something noble and almost ceremonial. Pilgrims with purpose, knights with banners, devout travellers marching toward distant lands where great battles would decide the fate of Christendom. What people did not imagine, at least not immediately, was the appetite. A man travelling alone eats modestly. A man travelling with a few companions eats more. But an army, especially one made up of knights, servants, animals, followers, hopeful volunteers, wandering preachers, and men who had joined simply because they were curious what might happen next. An army consumes the landscape. Fields become possibilities. Granaries become opportunities. Barns become negotiations. The first time a large religious expedition passed through a village, the experience might even have felt strangely festive. The travellers were pilgrims after all, holy men, warriors of God. Their cause sounded righteous, and their stories were exciting. They came from distant places. They carried relics, rumours, songs, and the restless energy of people who believed history had begun moving again. Villagers might bring bread, someone might offer wine, a priest might welcome them warmly. For a day or two, the whole thing might resemble a celebration. But celebrations are temporary, appetites are not. And as more groups travelled the same roads, as the excitement grew and more men decided to join, the cheerful novelty began to develop a heavier edge. Bread disappeared faster. Ale barrels emptied earlier. Smiths stopped sleeping regularly. Farmers began discovering hoof prints where crops had been. Someone's chickens vanished. Someone's pig failed to return to its pen. And suddenly, hospitality began to feel less like generosity and more like taxation. Not official taxation, of course. That would have required receipts. This was the older medieval system known as being present with weapons. Now, to be fair, not every crusader behaved badly. Many groups tried to pay when they could. Some leaders imposed discipline. Some towns negotiated supplies in advance. Some local communities were genuinely enthusiastic and willingly supported the movement, but large moving populations rarely remain orderly for long. A few thousand hungry men are a logistical problem. 10,000 become an agricultural emergency. Animals require fodder. Horses require grain. Carts break wheels. Leather straps snap. Iron shoes wear down. People grow impatient, and impatience is rarely improved by hunger. So villages began learning a subtle art of survival. They learned how to give enough to avoid anger, without giving so much that winter would become impossible. They learned which travellers were disciplined and which ones were best encouraged to move along quickly. They learned that a polite lie about empty storage might save the last sack of barley. They learned to hide food. This is one of those deeply human adaptations that appears in almost every war throughout history. When armies move through agricultural regions, grain begins disappearing into places no official inventory will ever discover. Sacks buried beneath floors, barrels concealed behind walls, grain stored with relatives in other villages. Livestock quietly moved to forest clearings where travellers would not think to look. None of this required written strategy. It was simply common sense spreading from household to household. Because villagers understood something, soldiers sometimes forgot. Harvest does not repeat itself instantly. Once eaten, grain is gone. And winter, unlike crusading enthusiasm, arrives every single year. Another interesting detail about medieval armies was that they travelled with far more people than official lists suggested. Wherever soldiers went, a second population followed. Servants, cooks, wagon drivers, merchants, labourers, priests, wandering craftsmen, opportunists, entertainers, beggars, and people who had simply attached themselves to the moving mass because movement itself offered opportunity. In effect, a crusading army resembled a travelling town, a very hungry town, a very loud town, a town with horses, a town that occasionally set fire to things. And this travelling town carried with it all the problems of any medieval settlement, only compressed into a restless shape that never stayed still for long. There were disputes, there were thefts, there were accusations, there were moments of devotion so sincere that observers later wrote about them with awe, and there were moments of greed so obvious that even the most forgiving chronicler had difficulty pretending otherwise, which meant that for people living along the roads, survival often required learning to read not only the movement of travellers, but the mood of the crowd. Were they singing? Were they quiet? Were their leaders nearby? Were the horses thin? Had they been travelling long without supplies? All of these details mattered. A disciplined group, led by experienced nobles, might pass through with relatively little damage. A restless crowd that had marched for days on half rations could transform a peaceful village into chaos within an afternoon, and once the pattern repeated often enough, people began adjusting their expectations. Hospitality faded. Caution replaced enthusiasm. Village gates closed earlier. Watchmen stayed awake longer. Travellers were greeted politely, but observed carefully, because what had begun as a holy movement had slowly revealed its other nature. It was also a supply chain, not a very organized supply chain, unfortunately, more of an improvisation. But like many improvisations in medieval Europe, repetition gradually turned it into something resembling a system. Certain towns became accustomed to provisioning armies. Merchants began specializing in military supplies. Transport networks grew busier. Smiths learned which repairs crusaders needed most frequently. Taverns learned which customers were most profitable and which ones required extra caution. Even monasteries found themselves involved, storing goods, offering medical care, or negotiating with passing forces to spare nearby land. The religious war was no longer simply a matter of belief. It had become an economic rhythm, a strange, uneasy rhythm in which fields, mills, animals, wagons, bread ovens, and rivers all participated, whether they wanted to or not. And like any rhythm, once it was established, it became difficult to stop, because every new expedition used the pathways created by the previous one. Every new army relied on the habits formed by earlier armies. Every village that had once survived a passing crusade now knew exactly what signs to watch for when the next one approached. And so survival became less about resisting the system and more about navigating it. Give a little, hide a little, smile politely, lock the barn, move the pigs, pretend the cellar is empty. Hope the travellers leave before someone in the crowd decides that God has also granted permission to inspect your grain stores personally. If that sounds exhausting, it probably was. But medieval life was full of exhausting adjustments. What began as a temporary movement, holy men travelling to defend the faith, had become a recurring disturbance that reshaped the daily calculations of farmers, merchants, priests, and entire towns. And the most ironic part of all was that many of the people feeding these armies believed sincerely in the cause. They might pray for victory. They might admire the courage of the warriors. They might hope that defending the faith would bring divine favor upon the land. But they also counted their grain carefully. Faith and arithmetic often share the same table, because even the most sacred army still needs dinner. And dinner, unfortunately, must come from somewhere, usually from the nearest field. There comes a moment in every medieval siege when the city stops pretending. At first, when news arrives that an army is approaching, people behave with a sort of strained optimism. Messengers rush through the gates. The bells ring. Officials shout instructions that sound confident enough if one does not listen too carefully. The gates are closed, yes, but they are closed with the air of something temporary. A precaution, a delay, a small inconvenience, while the situation clarifies itself. People continue their routines. Markets still open. Bakers still knead dough. Children still run in the streets, though their parents watch them more closely than usual. And everyone tells themselves the same comforting story. The army will pass, or negotiations will succeed, or the walls will hold long enough for someone important to arrive and solve the problem. But then the days pass, and the army does not leave. That is when the gates stop being symbolic and begin being real. In medieval Europe, cities were not merely clusters of buildings, they were containers. Everything inside the walls had been gathered there for protection. Grain, animals, tools, merchants, priests, craftsmen, travellers who happened to arrive at the wrong moment, refugees who arrived at the last possible moment, and the thousands of ordinary people whose lives had been unfolding normally until the road outside the walls changed its mind about them. Once the gates were closed, all of those lives had to fit together in a very limited space. At first, this felt reassuring. Walls are comforting objects. They are thick, visible, and honest about what they are trying to do. When you stand beside a stone wall that has endured a century of weather and war, it is easy to believe it will endure another month. Cities had survived sieges before. Everyone knew the stories. Chronicles were full of brave defenders, miraculous interventions, clever tricks, and dramatic relief armies arriving at the last possible moment. Stories are very good at skipping the boring parts. Unfortunately, sieges are mostly boring. They are long, they are slow, and they are dominated by arithmetic. How much grain is stored? How many mouths must eat? How long can the wells supply water? How many animals can be slaughtered without destroying the city's ability to recover afterward? These are not heroic questions, but they determine survival more reliably than courage. In the first weeks of a siege, the city might still function almost normally. There is food, there are supplies, the markets operate cautiously. Officials attempt to maintain order. The defenders patrol the walls with the disciplined energy of men who believe their preparations will soon be tested. Meanwhile, outside, the army settles in. Armies that intend to remain begin building things. This is one of the most unsettling signs for anyone watching from the walls. Temporary camps become organized camps. Tents multiply. Cooking fires appear in regular patterns. Wood is cut. Earth is moved. Machines begin to take shape. Trebuchets, ladders, towers, engines, whose only purpose is to remind the defenders that patience is a weapon too. And as the besieging army grows comfortable, the city begins to grow uncomfortable. Because inside the walls, the arithmetic begins to change. Bread becomes smaller. Meat becomes rarer. Animals that once had names become calculations. A horse that once carried a knight might now represent several weeks of meals. A donkey that once hauled water might now represent several days of survival. These are unpleasant thoughts, and medieval people did not enjoy them any more than we would. But sieges have a way of pushing unpleasant thoughts to the center of every conversation. At some point, someone suggests rationing. This suggestion is usually presented as a temporary measure, just until relief arrives, just until negotiations succeed, just until the enemy grows bored and leaves. Everyone agrees. Everyone pretends not to notice that rationing almost never moves in the opposite direction. Once food becomes scarce, it rarely becomes abundant again inside a besieged city. So, the portions shrink, first a little, then more. People adapt, because people always do. They eat slowly, they share carefully. They begin measuring time, not by bells, but by meals. And slowly, another transformation occurs. Crowds. Cities in peacetime are crowded already, but during a siege, they become dense with anxiety. Refugees fill empty spaces. Families gather together in houses that were never meant to hold so many people. Storage rooms become sleeping spaces. Courtyards fill with animals that cannot be safely kept outside the walls. The air grows heavier. Tempers grow shorter. Rumors begin to circulate with increasing enthusiasm. Rumors are always popular in cities under siege. Someone has heard that the enemy is starving. Someone has heard that the enemy has built a terrible new engine. Someone claims that reinforcements are coming. Someone insists the defenders have discovered a hidden supply of grain. Someone whispers that a traitor inside the walls has already arranged to open a gate. None of these stories can be confirmed, which makes them perfect for repetition. And as the weeks pass, the arithmetic becomes more serious. Grain stores drop lower. Animals disappear. Dogs vanish. Cats become suspiciously scarce. At this stage, medieval chronicles often become strangely quiet about the details of food. Chroniclers preferred not to dwell too long on the creative solutions people sometimes adopted when hunger reached its most persuasive stage. But everyone understood the logic. Survival has its own theology, and hunger is a very persuasive preacher. Meanwhile, on the walls, the defenders continue their routines. They watch the enemy camps grow larger and more organized. They listen to the steady rhythm of construction. They hear the distant creak of siege engines being assembled. Occasionally, a stone crashes against the walls, reminding everyone that patience is not the only weapon in use. Priests lead prayers. Relics are carried along the battlements. Crowds gather to watch ceremonies that promise divine protection. Faith becomes louder during sieges. This is natural. When ordinary solutions disappear, people reach for extraordinary ones. Processions move through the streets. Confessions increase. People promise God many things they intend to remember later if the city survives. And perhaps, sometimes, faith genuinely strengthens the defenders. But faith does not refill the granaries. Eventually, the city authorities face the most difficult calculation of all: too many mouths. It is one of the most brutal realities of siege warfare that a city cannot feed everyone who hides behind its walls. At first, refugees are welcomed. The gates open to farmers from nearby villages, travelers caught on the road, families who believed the walls would keep them safe. But when food begins to run out, kindness collides with mathematics. Someone must leave. Sometimes the city forces refugees back outside the gates, hoping the besieging army will allow them to pass through. Sometimes the army refuses. Sometimes the refugees remain trapped between the walls and the enemy lines, unwanted by both sides. It is one of the cruelest scenes medieval warfare produced, and it happened more than once. Inside the city, those who remain try not to think about it too much. There are still walls to defend, still stones to carry, still meals to divide, still prayers to say, and still the quiet hope that tomorrow something will change. Perhaps the enemy will leave. Perhaps relief will arrive. Perhaps the arithmetic will somehow improve. But sieges rarely reward optimism. More often, they reward endurance. Endurance of hunger. Endurance of fear. Endurance of the strange way time stretches, when every day feels identical to the last. And somewhere in the crowded streets below the walls, a baker measures flour with extreme care. A priest lights another candle. A guard stares into the enemy camp through the cold morning air. And thousands of ordinary people discover that surviving the wars of faith sometimes means doing nothing heroic at all. It means simply waiting. Waiting while the gates remain closed. Waiting while the world outside the walls decides what will happen next. If you had visited Jerusalem in the 11th century as a tired pilgrim, there was a place where you might have ended up without planning to. Not a fortress, not a palace, not even a church in the grand sense. Just a hospital, a place where strangers who had travelled too far, eaten too little, and suffered too much under the sun, could lie down for a while and allow their bodies to remember how breathing normally worked. Pilgrimage in medieval Europe was never comfortable. It involved dust, blisters, questionable food, unreliable weather, and the constant possibility that someone on the road might decide your belongings were better suited to their spiritual journey than your own. By the time pilgrims reached Jerusalem, many of them were exhausted, sick, injured, or quietly wondering whether salvation might have been achievable closer to home. So a hospital for pilgrims made perfect sense. It was a small act of mercy in a city that received travellers from every corner of Christendom. Beds were offered, food was provided, wounds were cleaned, fevers were watched patiently through the night by men who had chosen a life devoted to service. No one, at that moment, imagined they were founding an army. But medieval institutions had a habit of drifting. A temporary solution rarely remained temporary once it proved useful. And usefulness, in the medieval world, had a way of attracting responsibility, the way a warm kitchen attracts cats. The hospital in Jerusalem began as an act of charity. The men who served there were brothers in a religious sense, caring for the sick and the weak. Their identity was simple: hospitality, which is a beautiful word, though historically it has often ended up carrying more weight than originally intended. Because pilgrims did not arrive alone, they arrived along roads that were increasingly dangerous. They arrived through territories where power shifted constantly. They arrived in cities where politics and religion intertwined so tightly that one could not easily separate them without making someone very angry. And the hospital found itself doing something new, protecting people. At first, this protection was small and informal. Escorts, guards, armed men accompanying vulnerable travelers between dangerous stretches of road. Nothing dramatic, nothing that required a change of identity. Just a little extra safety. But protection has its own logic. Once you escort a few pilgrims, it seems sensible to escort more. Once you escort more, you begin organizing the escorts. Once escorts are organized, someone must train the men. Once men are trained, someone must arm them. Once men are armed, someone must command them. And before long the hospital that once smelled mostly of herbs, bread, and bandages begins to smell faintly of leather, iron, and horse sweat as well. No one necessarily decided this should happen. It simply solved problems. Medieval societies often preferred solutions that solved immediate problems, rather than worrying too much about the shape of those solutions 50 years later. That was a concern for future generations, who unfortunately had not yet arrived to object. So, the brothers of the hospital gradually developed a second identity. They remained caregivers, but they also became protectors. And protection, in the age of Crusades, quickly became military. Soon these men were no longer only watching over beds of sick pilgrims. They were guarding roads, defending settlements, maintaining fortifications, escorting travelers through dangerous territory, and participating in battles when necessary. It was not the most obvious career path for nurses. But medieval Europe was nothing if not flexible about job descriptions. The Order of the Hospital, later known as the Knights Hospitaller, slowly transformed from a charitable institution into something much more complicated. Not abandoning the hospital, never abandoning it entirely, but layering military responsibility on top of religious duty until the two became almost impossible to separate. A man might care for the sick in the morning and ride into battle in the afternoon, which sounds strange to modern ears, but made a certain sense in a world where survival often required combining roles that later centuries preferred to keep politely separate. And once the Hospitallers began doing this work effectively, they became extremely valuable. Cities relied on them. Pilgrims trusted them. Kings respected them. The church supported them. And with support came land. Land meant income. Income meant resources. Resources meant castles, ships, hospitals, fortresses, and a network of property stretching across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. What had begun as a building for sick travelers slowly grew into an international institution. And institutions, once they cross a certain threshold of usefulness, rarely shrink again. They expand. They accumulate responsibilities. They develop habits. They develop bureaucracy. They develop traditions that future members follow without always remembering exactly how they began. A visitor arriving in a Hospitaller fortress centuries later might have seen armored knights, disciplined soldiers, organized supply depots, and formidable stone walls overlooking strategic harbors. He might not have guessed that the entire system had grown from a very simple idea. Someone needed a place to sleep. Someone needed clean water. Someone needed someone to watch over them when fever made the world spin. Charity had built the foundation. War had added floors. And eventually, the building became so large that it was difficult to remember which part had been built first. This pattern appeared again and again during the Wars of Faith. A temporary solution became a permanent institution. A practical response to danger became a new structure of power. And people living within that structure slowly adjusted their expectations. If pilgrims travelled dangerous roads, they expected military orders to protect them. If frontier cities faced attack, they expected these orders to defend them. If armies marched east, they expected these disciplined brothers to fight beside them. And so the hospital continued its strange double life. Beds and swords, bandages and armour, prayers and battle plans, all woven together into a single institution that embodied the contradictions of medieval religious war better than almost anything else. Mercy and violence, sharing the same roof. And perhaps no one in the 12th century found this particularly strange, because medieval Europe had already learned that survival often required holding two opposing truths at the same time. You could pray sincerely for peace and still sharpen a sword. You could heal the wounded and still prepare to create more wounds tomorrow. It was not hypocrisy in the modern sense. It was simply the world they lived in, a world where the hospital had learned to fight, and where the wars of faith were slowly building institutions that would outlive the wars themselves. And so, as the fires of war spread quietly across medieval Europe, something else was spreading with them. Not only armies, not only banners and sermons, but habits. Small adjustments people made in order to survive. A wagon turned into a wall. A rumour turned into fear. A road that once carried merchants now carried soldiers. And for the people living in villages and towns scattered across the continent, the great wars of faith were no longer distant stories told by travellers. They were becoming part of daily life, part of the roads, part of the markets, part of the long, uncertain rhythm of the Middle Ages. And this is where our story will pause for tonight, because what happens next becomes even stranger. In the next part of our journey, we will see how ordinary tools, ordinary people, and ordinary decisions slowly created entirely new ways of surviving these wars. Wagon forts, frontier towns that learned to live with constant danger, military orders that quietly turned into entire countries. But for now, let the road grow quiet for a moment, and when you're ready, we will continue the journey.